Welcome to St. Paul's Episcopal Church here in Indianapolis. The people who are here know where we are, but perhaps you're watching from somewhere else. It's great to see you today. My name is John Denson. I'm the rector, the senior pastor of St. Paul's. We're gathered today, some of us here and some of us virtually, for the annual Spirit and Place Festival public conversation. Spirit and Place is part of the Indiana University School of Liberal Arts at IUPUI. And has been organizing the Spirit and Place Festival, the nation's only arts, humanities, and religion festival since 1996. Before I go on, a couple of practical things that are important to say as we get started. One is an apology. The ASL interpreter who was to be here this evening is not able to be here because of being sick. And as we know, in this time of pandemic, being sick is a reason to stay home. And so we do not have the ASL interpreter here this evening. Second thing is this, you're going to hear a little later from Spirit and Place on how you can provide support for their work. And that includes filling out a survey. If you're here at St. Paul's, should have been handed a survey. If you're watching online, you can go to spiritandplace.org. I'm sure you'll hear about how to do that, but it's really important to give that feedback because it helps Spirit and Place in planning for future events. So it's a pleasure for St. Paul's to be partnering with the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture as we host this evening's closing event for the festival. The Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture was established in 1989 to explore the connection between religion and other aspects of American culture. It is a research and public outreach institute supporting the ongoing scholarly discussion of the nature, terms, and dynamics of religion in America. As a program of the IU School of Liberal Arts at IUPUI, the center pursues its aim as part of the mission of liberal and humane learning. It seeks to elevate among students, faculty, and the larger American public the understanding of the influence of religion in the lives of people. The work that they do is extraordinarily important in the times in which we live. In Indiana, religion is still very important. It's not as important in other parts of the country, but it is still very important here. And so the work that they do in terms of understanding how religion and culture mix matters, not only to us, but also in this time in our nation in which there is so much that is being done and proclaimed in the name of religion, whether it is specifically religious or not, but reflects our culture and the divides and the disconnects of values in our culture. That we're gathered here at St. Paul's is not an accident. It's not even serendipitous. It is quite intentional. First, my own confession. When I started reading Robert P. Jones' book, White Too Long, I knew immediately that I was reading a book that would resonate with me. I was raised Southern Baptist in Alexandria, Virginia, so not Jackson, Mississippi, or the Deep South. But I was raised in that culture, and I was raised to have as my heroes the generals of the Confederacy, especially those who came from Virginia. I was born in Richmond, and what I would do is, living in Alexandria, is claim my true Southern roots by saying and claiming that I was born in Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. And my confession is that it took me far too long to recognize the power of those words to dehumanize others. Secondly, the reason we're here is because St. Paul's as a church has embodied in its history much of what Robert P. Jones writes in his book. So let me share a story. 120 years ago, the body of Huldah Abrams, a young black woman in Chicago who died there, was brought to Indianapolis for burial. The Reverend Lewis Brown, who was just in the first year or two of his 35-year tenure as the rector of St. Paul's, was asked to conduct the funeral at the home of Mr. and Mrs. A.W. Henderson. He agreed, And according to our history, the members of the black community were so grateful, they asked Reverend Brown to lead services for them regularly. He invited them to worship in the chapel of St. Paul's and to do so as St. Philip's Episcopal Church. St. Philip's had been a church for a few years, a black Episcopal church for a few years. It had for reasons I don't know, it had become defunct, and so it was reformed, worshiping in the chapel of St. Paul's. And Lewis Brown conducted services for St. Philip's for 12 years until they had built their own building and been able to call their own rector. We tell this story with great pride at St. Paul's. After all, Lewis Brown did something no other white clergy person would do. Yet we need to ask ourselves, it's important that we ask ourselves particular questions. Why were the members of the black community of Indianapolis invited to worship separately from the white congregation? Why at 4 o'clock in the afternoon instead of Sunday morning? Why in the chapel instead of the church? When St. Philip's was created, why did Lewis Brown and others believe that it was important to establish a separate congregation? Why did we not widen our circle of inclusion? Why did it take us so long to ask these questions? Why in the 1960s did a black family come to St. Paul's and were they politely told that they should go to St. Philip's where they would feel they belonged more? Why has it taken us so long to tell this story? There are those, and I'm certainly one who's done this, who claim that we need to be very careful about judging the actions of the past with the values that we hold today and our different cultural assumptions. But what happens when we're not just reacting to what's going on in the culture, but we were actually a part of shaping that culture? It's not an accident that separation of a black church and a white church happened at St. Paul's. For you see, in 1866, when St. Paul was formed, it was formed by Southern sympathizers who left Christ Church still down at the Circle, left Christ Church. They were either told to leave or they left voluntarily to form a separate congregation of Southern sympathizers. St. Paul's was nicknamed the Copperhead Church in its early years. If you don't know, Copperhead is the term that was used for Southern sympathizers who lived in the North. Our first rector was Horace Stringfellow, who had been the rector of Christ Church before leaving to go and be a chaplain in the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. After the war, he came back to Indianapolis and was welcomed in a congregation in which he seemed to fit very well because they held the same sympathies. The chapel in the original church, which was downtown, for those of you who know downtown, at New York and Illinois, the chapel in that church in 1893, after Horace Stringfellow died, was named for him. And so here is one of those sad ironies of our history, that the people of St. Philip's, for the first few years of their existence, worshipped in a chapel that was named for a Confederate chaplain. As Robert P. Jones writes in the introduction of White Too Long, it is time, indeed well beyond time, for white Christians in the United States to reckon with the racism of our past and the willful amnesia of our present. Underneath the glossy, self-congratulatory histories that white Christian churches have written about themselves is a thinly veiled, deeply troubling reality. White Christian churches have not just been complacent, they have not only been complicit. Rather, as the dominant cultural power in America, they have been responsible for constructing and sustaining a project to protect white supremacy and resist black equality. This is the work of St. Paul's today, to reckon with the racism of our past and our amnesia in the present. Now, St. Paul's is no longer the church of 1866 or 1901 or of the 1940s. In the 1940s, one of the leaders of St. Paul's was the mayor of Indianapolis at the time when redlining was established. In the 1940s, we moved north, the first church of any denomination to follow the white population north, to establish ourselves here at this place at Kessler and Meridian. We are no longer that church. We're no longer even a solely white congregation. We're predominantly white. We have people of color who are not only our members and worship with us, but also are a part. They are us. They're on our vestry, our governing board. They serve in our ministries. They have fellowship with us and worship with us. We are a different church than we were. But we have much that we need to learn and much growth that is important for us. We are good, faithful people, but we have too often fallen short. Too often we have allowed our history and our white privilege to be the blinders that limit our sight. We have chosen comfort instead of inconvenience, welcoming words over full inclusion, politeness over truth, sympathetic acts of charity instead of bearing witness for justice. Too often, and I confess this for myself, we have given into the temptation to say the words that make everyone feel good instead of speaking the truth. Not always, but at times, too many times, we have chosen to conform to the culture instead, as St. Paul writes in his letter to the Romans, of being transformed by the renewing of our minds. What's past is prologue, Antonio says in Act 2, Scene 1 of William Shakespeare's The Tempest. We can be bound by our past, or we can learn from it, confess it, and be set free to be the community God calls us to be. Our commitment today, and this is not a universal commitment, it would be, I cannot speak for all of the people of St. Paul's, and there are those who would rather us be, rather come to church and have us just say the nice things that they want to hear so that they can leave comfortably. But our commitment as the leadership of St. Paul's today is to break the silence, to speak the truth, to act for equity and justice, to listen and to learn, to be humble, to be partners who collaborate, to follow those who have been doing this work, to lead if and when we are called to do so. In the words of the prophet Micah, we seek to be a people who do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with our God and with all those in our community, whatever the color of their skin, whatever their racial history, whatever their identity, whatever the gender however they identify by their gender, whoever they love, we seek to follow and walk humbly together. Now, you are not here to hear me today, but I share that because I think it's important grounding. It's important grounding for us. It says why St. Paul's is so excited to be having this conversation happening here in our church tonight. Robert P. Jones and Leah Gunning Francis are here this evening. Now, you can find their biographies if you're here in your program. If for our online audience, just let me briefly share this. Robert P. Jones is the CEO and founder of Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, and is a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. His latest book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, draws on history, public opinion surveys, and personal experience to examine the ways in which white supremacy and racism are embedded in the DNA of white Christian identity. Tonight's gathering is not a lecture, but rather a moderated conversation guided by the skilled hands of Leah Gunning Francis, who is the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty at Christian Theological Seminary here in Indianapolis. Dr. Francis is the author of Ferguson and Faith, Sparking Leadership and Awakening Community, and its recent follow-up, Faith After Ferguson, Resilient Leadership in Pursuit of Racial Justice. Please join me in welcoming Robert P. Jones and Leah Gunning Francis.
Well, good evening, everyone. We're delighted that you're here this evening, and for all of those who are watching via live stream, we welcome you as well. And to Dr. Jones, a very special welcome to Indianapolis. We are so glad that you're here with us at St. Paul's this evening and look forward to a robust conversation tonight about your very, very important book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy and American Christianity. So thank you so much for being here. Great. Well, let's jump right into it. So in your book, you trace the contours of the historical relationship between Christianity, American Christianity, and white supremacy, and call us to reckon with this fact and to actually do something about it. I'm curious to know, how did you come to the title of White Too Long, and what does that even mean?
Great. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here. It's one of the very few times I've been in a room with people in the last year and a half. I'm not on. Okay, there we go. All right, much better. I'm sure everyone online appreciates that. Well, thank you for having me. As I was saying, it's one of the first times I've been in a room and looking at actual human faces. So I'm thrilled to be here, and also thrilled to be here at a church that has taken this call to reckon with its own history seriously and is beginning to do that, not only to understand who we are, but to understand who we want to be as we're going. And I think that gets me to really the answer here is, so I'm somebody who, I've got a lot of religious education. I grew up Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi. For any of you who may have grown up in anywhere near that context, as you know, there are lots of opportunities to go to church if you're a Southern Baptist. And I took advantage of most all of them. It wasn't unusual for me to be at church 5 days a week. 2 times on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday nights, and really it was usually Friday and Saturday you could count on a sabbatical from church. But other than that, there was stuff to do all the time, and I was there all the time. And what I realized, so I also have a Master of Divinity degree from the Southern Baptist Seminary and a PhD in religion from Emory. And out of all of that education, informal, formal, I realized just in the last 5-6 years or so, how ignorant I was of really my own history with and how it was connected to racism and white supremacy in this country. And there were a number of times along the way that I talk about in the book where there were little cracks in the edifice, right, where some light would start to come through. One early on, it was actually at seminary, where it wasn't until I was 20 years old that I got the full story of what the Southern in Southern Baptist meant. I'd spent all this time, and I thought it just meant geography, right? A kind of arrow on the compass. But what I, finally had a Baptist history professor that put it to me straight, and he just said, look, the convention, the Southern Baptist Convention was formed in 1845, and it was formed really over the issue of slavery. Now, that's a nice way, even that is a nice way of saying something that I tried to say more poignantly in the first sentence of the book, and that is that this painful awareness that the genesis story of my own denomination its mission was to make the gospel compatible with enslaving other people based on the color of their skin. Like that was the founding mission of my denomination, and very explicitly. It wasn't a wink and a wink, wink and a nod. I mean, it was written out in sermons, in prayers, in other documents. So I think that there was that early thing, and then I think, like many white Americans, and for white Christians, I think in particular, the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, raised my consciousness. But in particular, the murder of 9 African Americans in Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston. And one of the reasons why, besides the awfulness of that event and the loss of life, that it was perpetrated by a white Lutheran Christian who had been through confirmation process, had come up in the church, and that in his own telling of his rationale, as he was, after he'd been arrested and was in prison, he wrote in his journal this racist screed, but he called on Christians. He wanted Christianity to be a, quote, warrior's religion. And by that, he meant a race war that he was hoping to start in the name of racial identity, white supremacy, and Christianity. And I include one of the few, I think it's the only image in the book that I include that's not a chart with numbers on it, is actually an image of a white Jesus that he drew in this journal. And it's a white Jesus emerging from the tomb as a representative of the kind of resurrected warrior of religion that he really was calling on Christians to join him in. And, I think like many people, it was a wake-up call to realize things that we had seen and not paid attention to really needed interrogation. And that's really when I began to put pen to paper.
Interestingly, as you talk about the massacre at the Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina, what followed that were several, kind of iterations of wake-up calls. We had the Confederate flag that Bree Newsom went and took down at the South Carolina State House. But something I remember very distinctly, that instead of there being a lot of conversation about this was a person who was a Lutheran, who was baptized in the faith, was active, wrote a manifesto expressly, saying, I want to start a race war. Instead of that being the focus, there was a question to the surviving victims of the massacre: do you forgive? And so I'm curious to hear you reflect on why is it oftentimes that when there is an intentional, overt atrocity perpetrated against Black people in this way, the question that's always posed is, well, do you forgive them? And will you forgive them? As opposed to addressing the issue.
Yeah, well, I'll say something about that second piece of the question. There's no doubt in my mind, I write this in the book, that had Dylan Roof, the perpetrator, the murderer, had he been not Christian but Muslim, had he not drawn pictures of Jesus but Muhammad, there's no doubt in my mind what label would have been put on him by the media, right? It would have been like radical Islamic terrorists, right? Attacks and kills and murders people. But because he was Christian, the kind of dominant, and he was white, that part really mostly went by in the media. It didn't really get talked about in that way. Maybe he was a white supremacist, right? But his tie to Christianity really went by the wayside. I will say the ELCA denomination, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, did acknowledge this in their evaluation and really made a commitment and started some of their own introspection as a result of this. So it did kind of land there. But I think it's deflection, right, is the answer to your other question, right? Because it's easier to kind of focus then on things like forgiveness than to focus on the depth of the problem, right, that this really brings forward and really into focus. So shifting the focus as quickly as possible, I think, is part of what that's been about. And I think part of the thing that I have had to learn how to do as someone who grew up, thinking themselves white, Christian, evangelical, is learn how to sit with the discomfort, learn how to sit with the embarrassment, learn how to sit with the shame, learn how to sit with shock, and just let it be. So I think there's been a lot of times of taking it in. I think we are so good at sort of deflecting and just letting things bounce off, even when the obvious truth is right in front of us. And so I'm hoping that at least that's one thing the book does in the world, is kind of help white Christians sit with our own history in a way. And I think this is such a beautiful illustration of there's a kind of narrative that gets told. I was just writing this week for some future thing I'm writing on about Tulsa. There's a Presbyterian church in Tulsa that for a long time had told the story about how it had been a sanctuary, literally let their sanctuary be a sanctuary for African Americans that were fleeing the violence during the 1921 Tulsa race massacre. What never got told in that story is that the very week after, before the next Sunday rolled around, that they took out ads in the major newspapers in the city to ensure the white population that their sanctuary had been properly fumigated before the next Sunday rolled around.
We often hear a lot about, especially throughout the civil rights movement, of you had a lot of resistance to facets of white supremacy that showed up in terms of segregation of schools and restaurants and lunch counters, but not often of churches. And so to read in your book stories about people like James Meredith and the Jackson movement that was happening to integrate churches and the resistance that they were met with, talk some about crossing the color line in the church and what that has meant and how that took shape and why that was not talked about as much in the same way that issues related to voting in schools and restaurants and parks and swimming pools was.
Yeah.
What about crossing the color line at the church?
There's been some really great scholarship on this. Carolyn Dupree in a book called Mississippi Praying, other books called Sanctuary, another title is Sanctuaries of Segregation, really taking up that. And I think what really brought this home to me, so I'm from Jackson, Mississippi, the home of Medgar Evers. And again, well, first of all, I should say, my driveway was 11 miles from the driveway of Medgar Evers, where he was gunned down in 1963, and I never heard his name spoken in my church, in my public school. I went to public school from Jackson Public Schools. I never got taught anything about Medgar Evers, even though he's right there. And especially, I think this is especially poignant because even in the kind of mainstream stories about the organizing that he was doing, it's not widely known that the last thing he was doing before he was shot in front of his children at home, and shot, by the way, by an Episcopalian in good standing at an Episcopal church up in the Delta that drove down to assassinate him. The last thing he was doing was organizing a campaign to desegregate the two prominent Methodist and Baptist churches right downtown. One that was the home church of the mayor, and the other one, the Methodist church, was the home of the mayor, and the First Baptist Church of Jackson was the home church of the governor, Ross Barnett. And the last thing he was doing was trying to desegregate those churches, and he was killed, right, for that action, right, of trying to, that's how much. And there's a great line that in Mississippi Praying that kind of encapsulated this. It said, look, everybody knew that if desegregation was going to come to Jackson, it was going to come through the front door of the churches, right? And that holding the line in sanctuaries, and there were laws passed, right, that essentially made it against a local law for any non-white person to enter a sanctuary on Sunday morning. You could be arrested and taken to jail and fined for that. But holding that line was really important because of the role that churches were playing in justifying this entire white supremacist worldview. And the last thing I'll say on this that I think is really important, that really has brought it home to me as someone who has been a white Christian heritage, is to say this: if at any time in our church's history, white Christians had stood united and said no, we would not have had slavery, we would not have had segregation, we would not have had Jim Crow laws. It is on us. We were the moral justification for those laws.
And so how was the Bible used to justify this? What were some of the theological tenets that were constructed to justify it in church doctrine? All of that had to work together to be able to make this kind of justification. Share with us some about how that happened.
Sure. It's when I talk to a lot of white Christian churches today, I often get a response of, well, this was so obviously against the teachings of the Bible. How in the world did this happen? But if you go back and you read kind of the abolitionist, kind of fights before and the Civil War, what you see is that enslavers actually thought they had the better biblical argument, right? And many abolitionists had to work pretty hard because they could quote chapter and verse supporting slavery, and you had to kind of make different arguments as an abolitionist here. So things like I talk about the curse of Cain, also the curse of Ham. There were basically what happened is that white theologians read white supremacy back into the text, so that they literally trace the lineage back differently, so that white people and black people had different lineages that were rooted in the text. and that those lineages were, in both cases, the curse of Cain and the curse of Ham, the descendant of African Americans and non-white people were people who did either criminal or shameful things, right? And so it was not just a different a tracing back of that lineage, but a hierarchical one, where the white lineage was noble and did the right things, and the black lineage in the text, the way that white theologians traced it, literally traced their heritage back to a progenitor that was either a criminal or a sexual deviant.
And so to see that play out throughout our history and the ways in which we've been teaching, the Bible, and whether it's in seminaries or in churches and congregations, both explicitly and implicitly, this narrative has, taken root and informed so much of, how we function today. Why is it so difficult to see this? What is it that keeps one, especially people who are white, from seeing white supremacy, the ways in which, the Bible has been used to justify this type of discrimination? Why is that?
Yeah, it's complex, but I think it comes down to proximity and interest. So proximity, Martin Luther King was, said rightly that 11 a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. That's still largely true. If you look at the latest data that we have on multiracial churches, 86% of America's churches today are essentially monoracial churches. And that's even when you set the bar only at having 20% membership of the non-dominant race in the congregation. So part of it is just not being around, right? So they're worshiping in a bubble is kind of part of it. And then I think the other thing is that this worldview, this hierarchical worldview, serves white interests, right? So it is about power and one's place in society and seeing one's place. I think one of the biggest things that white Christian churches have to recover from is this idea that the country, that America, especially that word America, not just the United States, but America, and that cultural way we think about the country, is a promised land for white Christians. Like that basic belief, right? That the country is owned by us, is here for us, and letting go of that, I think, has been very, very difficult. I think it has set off a great amount of angst among white Christians, particularly in the last 10 years. And part of that is because the country is indeed changing. The country has gone in the last 10 years from being majority white Christian, demographically speaking, to no longer being majority white and Christian. So in 2008, when Barack Obama was first running for office, 54% of the country identified as white and Christian. That number today is 44%. And we crossed that threshold during the presidency of our first African American president. And so I think that symbolic presence of an African American at the head of the country, the changing demographics at the same time, has set off what I've often called just basically a great white Christian freakout in the country.
And you note that the U.S. Census Bureau states that by 2043, which is only 22 years away, that this country is on track to be majority non-white. Today, as we speak, there are more non-white children being born, more non-white children that are attending our schools, and that's today's reality. And so to wonder and see the urgency as to why we must continue to address these very pressing issues of when we talk about racial hierarchy, and what we need to do to correct that, is essentially important. I want to talk about symbols, because very often, a lot of times people think that, symbols don't matter, it's only actions, but symbols are in fact very, very powerful. And in our country, we're littered with iconography, with symbols, whether they come in the form of a flag or other things that really speak to and reinforce notions of white supremacy. And in your book, you talk about even a very stark symbol, the symbol of a Ku Klux Klan person in uniform. We all know that symbol. You talk in the book about when you were just in third grade, that you were going to a soccer game, and standing outside of the soccer game was a Ku Klux Klan member passing out literature to that was, very white supremacist. And how did you respond to that? Like, were people upset by that kind of thing? Was that, what was the response when that happened?
Yeah, this came from kind of a part of the kind of introspective process I did writing the book, and that was trying to try to recover when race was even visible to me. Now, it's something like only someone who grew up white can say, right? Because that is part of the power of whiteness and white supremacy, is that it remains invisible to those who benefit from it. So part of, I think, the process for me was even bringing that stuff to the surface where I could even interrogate it. And so that memory was part of one of the things. And what I remember about it was my parents very clearly saying, like, we don't agree with them. They're saying white people are better than others, and there was a kind of dismissal about it. But it was at Battlefield Park, which is Battlefield was a Confederate battlefield, and it was about so it was on the one hand kind of disturbing, but it was also something that for me kind of came and went. Right, it was a blip on the radar screen. Now, it was enough of a blip that I could bring it back up 30 years later. Right, so it stayed with me enough. It was kind of weird and seemed out of place enough, but it also was not something I had to work at it to even bring that back up. So it was, I think that's the thing that if you're white, you have this kind of comfort in doing, right? You can sort of let it be a blip and you go on with your life, right? Because, but did I think hard at the time? So I played on a team with African American kids about what their experience was driving by that on the way in. I gave that literally no thought.
Mm-hmm. And so part of what this type of work calls us to do is to go back in our minds and recall those experiences, because there are many, many people today that have either perpetrated those kinds of experiences or have them, and to recall those and be willing to sit with that discomfort, because there are, all kinds of things happening today that still speak to that. So for example, this past summer, one of our sons plays baseball, and he's on a travel team, and we were going into a baseball game that was just about 20 minutes or so north of here, and there are teams coming from all over, and we're going into the parking lot, and right at the entrance to the ball field, in comes a person driving a pickup truck and parks at the entrance of this field and has a giant Confederate flag waving affixed to the truck. Why did this person choose to do this? What was the message that this person was communicated? Well, in light of the history, in light of what we know about this symbol of this flag and what it was meant, he clearly was seeking to, one, intimidate and send a message about this hierarchical order. Here we are, at a baseball game. And so this has real implications for today. And I kept watching and wondering, okay, so are some of the white people here going to go and say something to him about how inappropriate this is? I don't think that happened. But it's time when you see something to say something.
Yeah. I mean, it's notable. So I live in Washington, D.C., where the Washington National Cathedral is. It's an Episcopal church, but it is also known as the Washington National Cathedral. Speaking of symbols, one of our big national symbols, was it 2 weeks ago, Colin Powell's funeral was held right in this space. And it's a space that has Billy Graham's funeral there, president's funerals are there, and memorial services. But it was up until the last 5 years, there had been a set of stained glass windows installed in the sanctuary there that were tributes to Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, and that actually had Confederate flags in the stained glass, embedded in the stained glass, and were only removed in the last 5 years, really since Charleston, since Charlottesville, and since George Floyd's death. And it was a kind of multi-stage process. First, they just removed the Confederate flag panes, but left the stained glass in and just put little clear things. And then finally, had a deconsecration service to remove the entire bank of windows from the chapel, but from the cathedral. But that's in our nation's capital, in our, in a place that has a highly symbolic nature. Right. Now, those windows were put there by the United Daughters of the Confederacy after a lot of lobbying, because they wanted that signifier in our nation's capital, in that symbolic space. to kind of claim this lost cause of the Confederacy in that Christian space.
Share with us more about the monument movement that was launched and sustained by the Daughters of the Confederacy.
Yeah, one of the things so I grew up in the South, and you couldn't turn a street corner without seeing a Confederate monument in both where my parents are from, in Macon, Georgia, and in Jackson, Mississippi. So these were things that were just everywhere for me growing up. What I didn't really understand, I think, and what really shifted my own perspective on the monuments movement is that most of these monuments actually weren't put up during the Civil War, even right after the Civil War. They were put up in the 20th century. And they were put up by a deliberate movement of this group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And this group was organized in a lot of kind of upper class circles, including a lot of Christian churches. It was a women's movement. It was 100,000 women strong in its heyday in the early 20th century. But they saw this movement really as an education movement, not only to commemorate the past, but to educate the next generation. They would often incorporate church children's choirs into the dedication ceremonies of these monuments when they were dedicated, would hold simultaneous worship services in conjunction with the memorials. And so just realizing how tied up this was in really Christian identity and white Christian identity, and seeing as a way of kind of stitching together white Christian identity, white supremacy, and this sense that, well, we lost the war, but these ideals live on, right? And these ideals, and if you look at where they got placed on public property, often on courthouse, spaces, the reason for that, right, of course, is just to say, like, the war was lost, but that Confederate on a big pedestal at the county courthouse is there to say, we know who is still in charge, right? And it's notable that even in Richmond, I spent some time there. The monuments in Richmond have just come down in 2020 and 2021. I mean, that's they've been standing since they were put up between I think 1904 and I guess 1890 was already Lee. Jefferson Davis was 1904. Some others in 1920. But then they stood there for 100 years, where every person in Richmond had to drive down Monument Avenue around these big traffic circles with declarations of white supremacy every day. And they're just now down, just this past year.
And only a fraction have come down around the country, correct?
Yeah, that's right. I think the last thing I looked at, there are over 600 memorials to the Confederacy on public land still standing in the country.
If you see something, say something. I also want to talk about another symbol of racial terror, in particular, that of lynching. So in his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, Dr. James Cone sort of talks about, these two very powerful symbols and how they came together for us in the 19th and 20th century so prominently. You talk about this also in your book. What is at stake for Christians, for American Christianity, if we do not take seriously the role that Christianity has played in constructing and supporting these kinds of things? You also note that Frederick Douglass talked about the slave auctioneer's bell and the church bells often rang together. And we saw that happening with lynching. You give a description where there were churches that they would let out of church on Sunday morning, and after letting out of church would gather into a processional that was marching toward a public lynching. So you saw this kind of conflation happen throughout history. And what's at stake if we don't acknowledge, confront this part of the history of Christianity?
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to the same thing again, because I think it's so important. If at any time white Christians had united and said no more, no longer, we won't support it in our community, we won't support it in the country. I think about Ida B. Wells and the anti-lynching movement, and these flags that they would hang out. Another man was lynched today. Yeah. To raise awareness about it. And I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to go to Montgomery, to the National Memorial for Peace and Healing in Montgomery. But I went and I traced, we moved around a fair amount when I was younger, from Texas to Georgia, and I traced every county I'd lived in, and out of 7 different counties, there's only one county that I lived in that did not have a history of lynching African Americans. It's over 4,400 documented cases of people lynched, and mostly African Americans in this country here. And I think, again, kind of taking that seriously, this was something that Christian churches turned a blind eye to, Christian churches didn't address, even when it was in their own community, and even when it's some of the most extreme examples, like in Atlanta. I mean, the example you gave in Atlanta was that there was a lynching, but by the way, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution published a story inciting the lynchings, announcing that it was going to happen ahead of time. And by the way, that paper was run by the Candler family, who of Methodist fame and of Candler Divinity School, where we both went at Emory University, tied up with this kind of prominent Methodist family. But it was there's documented history of that was announced on Saturday in the paper, and on Sunday when churches let out, there were so many white Christians streaming out of churches toward the train station that they had to pull special trains together to accommodate all the people who were leaving church and wanting to go straight to the lynching. Did that get addressed in any church? I could find no record that got addressed in any white Christian church before, during, or after the event. I was just mentioning Tulsa. One more quick point. In Tulsa, after as many as 300, we don't really have a full body count, but as many as 300 African Americans were killed over 2 days of violence, mostly at the hands of their white neighbors. The Methodist bishop showed up from Dallas to preach in the most prominent Methodist church in the city, and he proceeded to blame the violence on African Americans and give the solution if he pointed the finger at white people at all, he pointed the finger at them and said that they had been too lax with the help and allowed vice to put on our African Americans, or our Negroes was the language, our Negroes. We've been too lenient with our Negroes and with the help. And that allowed vice to grow among them, and that spilled over into the violence. Blamed it all on the African American community. There even. So this is one more example of not just kind of, even in that it wasn't just turning a blind eye, but it was absolving in a single stroke the deaths of upwards of 300 African Americans, and what was literally a massacre in Tulsa from one of the most prominent pulpits in the country.
And there's more stories like that,
sure,
right?
Yeah,
where
yeah.
there are.
But they're not. We don't know them. That's the thing, right?
Uh-huh.
Those stories are there. Like, it didn't take that much digging. I didn't have to go to the Tulsa and dig through some dusty basement archives. Like, a few minutes on the internet, it's right there, right? Including a full page story from the Tulsa World from June of 1921, where his sermon was printed on the front page, by the way, of the Tulsa World, the Monday after the Sunday. So it's right there. And so I think this what I mentioned about willful ignorance, I think is it's ignorance, but it's willful ignorance, I think, that we've got to overcome.
And so to do that, one of the things we have to do is tell the truth. And throughout the book, you are beckoning us, calling us, laying out the framework, number one, that's a more truthful one about the history of Christianity in this country. And if we are going to move forward in a way that is truly equitable, faced with the tenets of our Christian faith, one of love and justice, we have to tell the truth. But today that can seem kind of countercultural for some. And so what do we say to people who are finding themselves, well, maybe there's blame on both sides, or, well, I wasn't there, so I don't know. What are some steps that people can take today to start learning, acknowledging, and reckoning with the truth of the past? Now, one of the things I think that opens the door for us to do that even more recently is the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. I say that because for the past, decade almost, we have seen time after time when Black people are standing up and saying that Black lives matter, which means Black lives have not mattered in the same way as white lives, it's met with heavy-handedness, it's met with tear gas, it's met with tanks, it's met with all kinds of brutality. And we see on January 6th at the U.S. Capitol building that at the foot of the Capitol, we saw people that were pushing, shoving, hitting, spitting at police officers, making their way all the way up the steps of the U.S. Capitol, busting out the windows, beating police officers with flags, making their way all the way to the floor of the Senate, correct? And when they get there, they do something that was considered quite religious. There were those that were there, they took off masks and hats, whatever they were wearing, and said a prayer. Did you see that?
Well, I think we have to take seriously what's right in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the problems, that we selectively filtered what we'll acknowledge as significant and what isn't.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a piece on January 7th for Religion News Service, and the title of it was Taking the White Christian Nationalist Symbols at the Insurrection Seriously.
Yeah.
And for me, what was striking about that was that we saw side by side, literally side by side, Confederate flags and Bibles, white supremacist symbols, anti-Semitic symbols and slogans with the Christian flag. So it was the Confederate flag, yes, but there's video of that breached Senate chamber with the Confederate flag marching in, and then a few minutes later, the Christian flag, marches in. It's that white flag with a blue canton and a red Latin cross up in the center of the canton that like I remember seeing up on the kind of stage right in my church growing up. That was something. We even had a pledge to the Christian flag that I remember saying in Vacation Bible School. But that flag was marched alongside of white supremacist symbols, and these weren't separate groups with disparate interests. And I think we have to take that really seriously. I mean, like, what does it mean that the Christian flag and Bibles and people with Bible verses on their shirt could march comfortably beside overtly white supremacist and anti-Semitic forces in the country? Like, what does it mean that Dylan Roof can draw the symbol of Jesus right next to a white supremacist screed? Like, we have to not dismiss those things as kind of fringe or something that we don't have to deal with or have nothing to do with us. And so I think that's part of it. I think the other piece of it, I'll say, is that those of us who sort of grew up thinking of ourselves as white and Christian have not quite grasped, I think I say this as a confession of myself, that it is in our interest to reckon with this history. Right? This is not something we need to do for someone else. I mean, there is certainly repair work and confession work that needs to happen on behalf of white people to African Americans. There's no doubt about that. But I think what white people think is that, this is a work of altruism, right? But don't grasp how deeply disfigured our own faith has become by allowing white supremacy to sit side by side in sanctuaries like this for centuries. And if we take seriously that insidious presence that sat comfortably with scripture readings and hymn singing and sermons, we've got to realize something is deeply, deeply wrong. And to think we don't have any work to do if you take that seriously, I think is I don't think you can hold those two things together in your head.
And so how do churches, individuals begin to do that? How do they embark on this enterprise of truth-telling, of acknowledging, of moving toward repairing the damage that has been done? We have, let me let you go with that.
Well, I realize I didn't fully answer your very first question. That is, where's the word white too long comes from. So I'll answer it here. And it comes actually from a quote from James Baldwin that he wrote in a New York Times piece that he wrote just a few months after Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. And he, like King and others, I think, had always been hoping that there would be this big uprising of white people, and particularly white Christians, on the side of civil rights and the movement for black equality. That never happened. It never came. right? And I think he's realizing that even with the murder of Martin Luther King, there was no big uprising among white Christians and white people in the country. And so he writes this op-ed in the New York Times where he's just despondent, really, at that prospect. And the phrase he uses there, he says, I've been convinced and have been for some time by whites in America, and have been for some time. They've impressed me as being, and this kind of phrase that is just, if there's any phrase that sort of stayed with me as I wrote the whole book, that he said, they have impressed me and have for some time as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. And then the next line was, they have been white, if I may so put it, too long. They have been married to the lie of white supremacy too long. And I think that phrase, like, what has whiteness, like this being wedded to whiteness, and this pre-commitment to white supremacy, and by that I don't mean like just the KKK and that robed figure, but to the basic idea, fundamental idea that white lives are more important and more valuable than others. Like, that's what it really comes down to, and that idea has been able to flourish in white Christian churches. And so I think one thing we could do is we can tell more honest stories. And so I think the story that we heard here tonight is exemplary from that. The other piece that I think is basically two things that I think have to happen. One is truth-telling. That has to do with who we are, having a better sense of who we are, telling a more honest story about who we are, because that's the only way we get to who we want to be. Right? We can't get to who we want to be if we don't know who we are. And knowing who we are, if you've sort of grown up in white Christian traditions, is not a simple thing. It's going to be a struggle to really do that well. And the other piece of it is repairing the damage and doing work for justice. I think that white churches have begun the path. Many white churches like this one, others have begun the path to truth-telling. There are fewer that are really doing the work of repairing the damage, thinking about how to repair the damage, how do we do work for justice. And the one thing I want to cut off at the root, or pull out at the root, is something I actually learned from two churches in Macon, Georgia, that I studied for the book, is that this banner of racial reconciliation is one that I think white people should stop talking about. I kind of learned that's actually what the pastor of the predominantly white Baptist church in Macon told me. He said, "This one thing I've learned is that what white people want to do is say I'm sorry and move to reconciliation." Now, if you're white, that's a pretty good deal, right? Because it skips all the hard stuff. It skips, and if we think about a fuller, I think we also have to really recover within white Christianity a fuller meaning of repentance. It's really a doctrine of sin and repentance that we're talking about here, a fuller one. Like, it doesn't just mean saying we're sorry, right? But it means repairing the damage, right? We're responsible for repairing the damage as best we can, and I think that if we stop talking about reconciliation and we start talking about telling the truth and loving our neighbors and working for justice, that reconciliation piece is going to take care of itself if we do that work right.
And so to be able to do that in a time where we find ourselves embroiled in this manufactured accusation of critical race theory being something that is responsible for so much of the angst, if you will, of what's happening in schools across countries. What do we do with that? Because we know that, can you share with us some about why you believe, in fact, this has been a manufactured enterprise and what we need to do if we're going to be serious about truth-telling in this country?
Yeah, well, I wrote a piece just a few weeks ago on a Substack newsletter that I have. It's robertpjones.substack.com if you want to look it up. But I just called it, and it really is about shutting down the manufactured critical race theory debate. I mean, there's really good evidence that this is not something that is boiled up from the ground up, but is something that has been dropped in as a political tool. And it's been sort of fueled by Fox News. It was mentioned, for example, not hardly at all up until the summer of 2020, and then it was mentioned 1,900 times on Fox News in a period of 3 months leading up to the legislative session beginning in fall of 2020, and then we start seeing these bills popping up everywhere, right? So it's very clear that's what it's about. It's also worth asking, whenever you see something kind moving up like this, it's worth asking, like, why now?
Mm-hmm.
What's going on? Like, why now? You know, and I think that what we're seeing is that we are in a great, age of kind of reconsideration, reevaluating. We are rethinking things, and that is a dangerous thing to do. And so I think there is this kind of more truth-telling that's going on, and those winds, I think, are blowing pretty strongly. And this is clearly a defensive action against those winds, and a kind of doubling down, on kind of more honest accounting of our history. But I think that the good news is that when we actually ask people, without using the term critical race theory, but we actually ask people in public surveys, we've done this in 2 surveys now, one in the summer, one in the fall, we have overwhelming agreement among like everyday Americans, both Republican and Democrat, that we should be telling the whole truth about our history, not just the things that make our country great, right? But our worst mistakes need to be part of what we're teaching our kids. So there actually is more agreement than the kind of that would suggest. But it's I think it's worth just naming this. It's not a debate. Like, it's not a debate. It's a political tool that's really a reaction to the movement, really, to tell the truth.
And so as congregations, churches think about, the work that they do in investigating their own histories, learning about the broader history of white supremacy and American Christianity, individual congregations and denominations, their histories, to also realize their roles in their local communities of speaking up and speaking out about these truths. Because all across this country, there are school board meetings, there are educators being terrorized that if they even mention the word race or racism or white privilege in their classrooms, they're being threatened with being fired or other kinds of drastic measures. So to think about a faithful response to what is happening right now in the effort for telling the truth, it's going to be important that people continue, when you see and hear something, to say something, because silence really is complicity. To know that something isn't right like that and to just say nothing is really to be complicit with this. And so to muster up the courage to say something in response to it. Speaking of talking, so the holidays are coming up. They're right around the corner, aren't they? And lo and behold, there will be families and friends gathering at tables and in homes and spaces all across the country. And inevitably, there will be people that have divergent points of views of the very things that we've been talking about this evening. What do you say to someone who feels as though he or she may be a minority voice in the context in which they'll be dining or, celebrating the holidays this season? What do you say when they might want to say something but don't necessarily have the courage to do so? What do you say?
I guess a couple of things. Families are not legislative sessions, right? And I think it's challenging. We've asked a survey, and this holiday challenge coming up for those who are traveling is clearly, according to the survey, a more troubling thing for white Americans than non-white Americans. More non-white Americans say their families are more politically divided now than they were 5 years ago than non-white Americans do, right? So this is a particular challenge, I think, among white Americans. We've got a good Christian word for this. I mean, and James Baldwin loved this term. I think we bear witness, right? That's what we do. We tell stories. We bear witness. We say where we are. And I think I think that's not a debate. That's not an argument, but it is a truth telling, right? It doesn't even have to be that combative, but I think the reason why that's important, I think, is because in many of those settings, we may be the only voice that has that perspective, right? So kind of adding that, I think, because I think for many white people and white Christians in particular, the idea of discomfort is challenging, right? And that many of us live in bubbles that we can just comfortably move along. So the creation of cognitive dissonance, I think, is often a place where the Spirit works, to speak theologically on this, right? It creates space. Like nothing gets resolved, nothing may get resolved, there may not be any agreements, but I think just this sharing of perspectives plants, I think, seeds that, the Spirit can do something with.
Mm-hmm. And to be open to the Spirit moving in that way, because so often people have said, oh, once certain groups of people start to die off, then racist ideals, racist ideology will die off with it. But we've seen that that's not the case. We saw at the University of Virginia where there were young people marching with tiki torches onto the campus in opposition to what was happening with the removal of the statue. So it's clearly racism is continuing to be passed down from generation to generation. And so we bring up this point of families and community gatherings because this is where the stories are told. These are the spaces where stories are often told. And to be willing to tell a more truer, faithful story is going to be critical to stopping the spread of racism.
I think there's one thing I'll say on that. Just, I think for me, right, too, it's like, this is the journey I'm on. Right? These are some things I've been thinking about. I mean, that's about me, right? And I think that's an opening and a way that really is about helping, families get to know each other, right? And what's really going on. So it's kind of part of, again, I think bearing witness is a good way of thinking about it. Yeah.
And how can churches bear witness? As you think about, say a congregation is reading your book, they're interested in delving into this truth, what are some tangible action steps that they can take?
Yeah, well, I think one of them is telling your own story. And I again love this, but I think starting with, if every white church in America asked the question, why is our church located where it is in our community? It would be a game changer. Right? Because if it's an older church, it's probably in an older area of the town that was redlined as a whites-only part of town, and may have actually been part of that process of guaranteeing that was a whites-only part of town. Many of those neighborhood associations met in church basements or sanctuaries. If it's a newer church that's moved somewhere in the post-World War II, white flight, as this church's story is probably part of that story. They probably followed their congregation out. There's actually churches that have done that twice now, right? Followed one wave of white flight and then another wave of white flight. The church that I grew up in, was kind of started in a kind of suburban county, got annexed by the city. The neighborhood started changing, and then it moves out one click further there. So I think that's a piece of it. I think thinking about partnerships is really important. I think again, that 11 a.m. is the most segregated hour in the country. We've done other survey work that also shows that the average white person's friendship network is 93% white, and 75% of white people have absolutely no person of color in their close friendship network. So kind of working on that's one thing churches can do. I mean, it's hard for individuals, the way our society is organized, to kind of get across some of those racial divides. But I think institutions can provide some framework and some structure for those kinds of things to happen. Those are hard things to do. But I think building up those things. I think the other thing is paying attention to the symbols, right? Do we have a white Jesus present in the congregation and the stained glass windows, right? The symbols, we have symbols all around us because they matter, right? Because they are designed as people are daydreaming during the sermon, right? To kind of pick up other things that might be important to the faith. And so like thinking about and being conscious of those sorts of things. I think there's a ton of things to do, but I think also being hubs where people can tell their own family stories, I think is a part of a kind of awakening that we really need.
This has been so impactful. Thank you so much for this book. Thank you for this work. And thank you for bearing witness to the truth that we all need to hear. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
We now turn to a time of audience engagement and welcome Erin Kelly and LaShonda Crow Storm to the microphone.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Erin Kelly, and I'm the Program Director for Spirit in Place.
And I'm LaShonda Crow-Storm, the Community Engagement Director with Spirit in Place. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge we are all standing on traditional homelands once belonging to indigenous people who were unjustly and violently removed from this land. Spirit in Place's home is in central Indiana. We acknowledge and honor the Miami, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and others who cared for this land long before our arrival and continue to do so. As members of the IUPUI community, Spirit in Place also acknowledges the displacement of a vibrant Black community due to campus development. We honor those affected by systemic racism and injustice by centering them in our work.
Now, right now, we're guessing everyone, whether here at St. Paul's or online, is feeling something, right? You're feeling something, some kind of emotion, and more than likely, some sort of physical sensation. Here's what we invite you to do for just a couple seconds, and if you don't want to, it's fine. It's a pandemic. If you don't want to talk to somebody, just hold up your hand. But we want you to get it out. Turn to somebody near you and just say what you're feeling. At home, you can put it in the chat if you don't have anyone at home who's watching with you.
Expect them to do that. Just a second. Okay. Wait till they stop. Where are you at? Right here. Oh, okay. Lucky I love you for this tight quarters.
Okay, so good. Hope you've had that little mini moment of release, a little miniature moment of catharsis there to share with somebody what it is you're feeling.
Say clap once if you can hear me.
I'll give them a second. Okay, everybody. Thank you again. Thank you for sharing with each other. Now, typically, if I can have your attention now, good talk though, but typically, at events, this is where you turn to the audience Q&A, right? Now, for those of you who know Spirit in Place, you know we're not typical. So we're not going to do a traditional Q&A tonight. Now, this isn't because your questions aren't important. They are important. But the reality is, we would only have the ability for a few of you to ask questions. And that means most of you would be sitting there observing. And another thing for those of you who know Spirit in Place, know that we are not an organization that's about sitting back and observing. That's not who we are, especially when we are trying to do the work of dismantling racism. So we don't want you to walk out of here tonight or to log out tonight without spending a few intentional moments in reflection and human connection.
So to get us started, again, Spirit in Place is not about being voyeurs. We are about being participants in the world around us. We'd like you to take a moment, and we're going to do a couple of exercises to get us all grounded. So you can do a couple of things if you're at home or if you're here with us. You can either take one hand and put it on your stomach and the other one on your heart. We're going to do a couple of deep breathing. If you could all close your eyes so you could start settling within your own self. Don't look at me, please. I know this is gorgeousness up here, but I really want you to settle within yourself. And if you know you are breathing correctly, we want you to take like a really deep life breath. Your stomach should move, not your chest. And that way you know that you're getting that life-affirming breath to the deepest parts of your lungs. So we're just going to take a couple minutes and count. So on 1, breathe in, 2, 3, 4, 5, hold it, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now let it out hard, like you can hear it across the street. Really hard. 2, 3, 4, 5. And we're going to do it one more time. We want that deep life breath at the bottom of your lungs. Your belly should be rising and your chest should be still. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold it. 2, 3, 4, 5. Now let it out. We still want you to keep your eyes closed. And we want you to just reflect as you listen to these few passages from White Too Long. And we want you to really kind of keep your hands there, or just settle in your body and pay attention as to what happens to your body as you start to hear these passages.
White Christianity has been many things for America, but whatever else it has been, and the country is indebted to it for a good many things, it has also been the primary institution legitimizing and propagating white power and dominance.
Passage 2. It's nothing short of astonishing that a religious tradition with relentless emphasis on salvation and so hyper-attuned to personal sin can simultaneously maintain such blindness to social sins swirling about it, such as slavery and race-based segregation and bigotry.
Final section. The white Christian shuffle. A subtle 2 steps forward, 1 step back pattern of lamenting past sins in great detail, even admitting they have had pernicious effects, but then ultimately denying that their legacy requires reparative or costly actions in the present. It's a sophisticated rhetorical strategy that emphasizes lament and apology, expects absolution and reconciliation, but gives scant attention to questions of justice, repair, or accountability.
Now we're going to take another breath, and I want you to keep your eyes closed. And I hope during this time you've actually been paying attention as to what your body has done as you've listened to these passages. Did you feel in your body spaces where you may have tightened up, contracted when you heard certain things from either our passages or even the talk? Did you find that your breathing changed? Did your heart skip a beat? Did you find butterflies in your stomach started to kind of flitter around? Or maybe you wanted to get up and run or turn off your computer? Did you get antsy in your seat, fidgety? Did you find your palms sweating? Did at some point in this time, did you disconnect? Because maybe it was just a little bit too honest for you. With that, let's take a breath. Deep, life-affirming breath at the bottom of your lungs. We're going to go on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hold it. 2, 3, 4, 5. Now shake your hands and breathe it out across the room. Shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it. Move those hands, shake it. 2, 3, 4, 5. And open your eyes, please.
When you came in, everyone should have been given a blank card, and hopefully the folks at home, you've got a scrap piece of paper to write on. Now, we're not going to collect these cards, but we're big believers in writing at Spirit and Place, writing down our thoughts, journaling, that sort of thing. The process of writing can be really beneficial. So what I'd like for you to do on one side of the card is just write down a few words or phrases that describe what you felt in your body if at any point tonight you became uncomfortable with the conversation, with the passages we read, with the things that Dr. Gunning Francis and Robert Jones talked about. Just don't overthink it. Just acknowledge your body's sensations and just jot some of these things down. We'll just give you 30 seconds or so.
And you can continue to write as you think about this, but it's important that we acknowledge these difficult histories and that we develop the skills to learn how to talk about them. It's important to learn how to literally sit with discomfort and pay attention to how it sits in our body. Being able to mentally, emotionally, and physically work through this discomfort is a practice that we're going to need for a lifetime if we're going to work toward dismantling white supremacy.
And it is a practice that those of us who are white especially need to adopt. Let's be truthful here. Oftentimes as white people, we are most comfortable with abstract ideals around racial equality and justice. But when confronted with the personal and intimate ways our lives intersect and even uphold racist systems, we become uncomfortable. We become agitated, and ultimately that makes us resistant to doing the lifetime work of change that is required.
We like to talk about reconciliation, and if you're a part of Spirit in Place, you know we have kind of nixed that whole line of discussion with the work that we do.
We wanted to applaud that earlier.
Yes, I was clapping. I don't know if you saw me in my seat. This work isn't easy and it asks an awful lot. It is necessary. You can do the readings, you can go to talks, you can come to Spirit in Place events like this. You can participate in powerful conversations on race. But we also learned that your body has a lot to tell you, even if your mind isn't paying attention. So you also need to pay attention to your body and stay focused as you start to commit to this work. Now flip your card over real quick. This time write down 3 words: justice, repair, and accountability. Justice, repair, and accountability. Those are the words that we need to all work toward. Right now, we wanted to take a moment and really reflect and write about at least one of these 3 things tied to these words: justice, repair, and accountability. Ask yourself, what should justice look like when practicing your congregation, your own life, your workplace, your community? What does repair look like if you centered that in your own work, your own congregation, all the work you do in community? And what does it mean for you to show up in the world and be accountable to creating a future that is just for all? Now, not in the past, but how do we do that work now? So we're just going to take about 90 seconds for you to reflect on that and to at least be able to write 2 things down attached to one of these words.
Keep writing as you need to. Now we are going to ask a couple of, if we have any volunteers though, we are going to call on a few of you to go ahead and stand and just sort of shout out. We'll repeat it for the viewers at home. But what does justice look like when it's practiced in your congregation, in your community life, in your family life? Would anyone like to share? It's okay. If you guys are still reflecting on it and still trying to figure out what that looks like at a deeply meaningful level, that's okay. That's the work you need to do. But if anyone would like to share anything, we invite you to do so. Getting what out to those in need? All right, for those at home, we've had someone stand to say they'd like to, justice in the community would be getting rental assistance and help out to those in need. Yes, ma'am. Justice looks like everyone having a fair shot and being able to start at the same starting point and having an equal opportunity to get to the finish line. Thank you. So what I hear you saying is that justice means white people need to deal with and understand their whiteness and how that operates in the world, and that space needs to be created for Black people to have an opportunity to heal and to deal with the trauma that has been inflicted upon Black people. Am I getting that right? Okay. Okay. What does it mean to live a life as white without it being the dominant superior, the misguided dominant superior mindset that guides everything else? A new way to be white. An opportunity to reckon with the past in a more, truthful way. Okay. And what? Find a way forward, yeah. Anyone else want to share anything, your thoughts on this idea of justice, what it looks like, repair, what it looks like, or accountability? Stop the silence. Stop being complicit, stop being silent. Thank you, yeah. For white people, yep. So for white people to stop being silent because silence is complicity, and for Black people to be honest and to fight. Did I hear that correctly? Not assimilate, yeah.
I would also encourage, because we talk a lot, especially in powerful conversations, that this work is not about being a voyeur. But what we've noticed is most of the folks who are doing the talking about these things are about repair, accountability, and justice are actually people of color. So I would really encourage our white participants to start participating, because the only way to address white supremacy is to actually full frontal, everyone's got to participate in the dismantling of it. And it can be uncomfortable, but it is what must be done if we are serious about this transformation.
All right. Now I know some of you, because I'm reading the body language, I know some of you are uncomfortable right now. And I know that this discomfort might sit with you for a while longer. That's good. That's okay. Don't get stuck there, though. Resources and tools exist to help you move through the discomfort so that you can continue your journey, so that you can, as Dr. Gunning Francis pointed out repeatedly, say something when you see something. Now, we think you absolutely should read books like White Too Long and Faith After Ferguson. You might want to also check out Resmaa Menakem's My Grandmother's Hands as a tool to help you figure out what your body's doing in those times of discomfort so you can move through it to continue to do the work.
We would also encourage you to visit Spirit and Pace's webpage. If you don't know what that is, it's www.spiritand place.org. We have several resources that you can utilize to start doing this work around racial justice, racial repair, and healing. You can also come to our powerful conversations on race discussions, where we do this work once a month to bring community together to have difficult conversations so that you can take those skills back into your community. On our research page, you will see the work that we are doing in this realm. You will see the work of others in our community and nationwide. So there are resources out there where you don't have to have the willful ignorance anymore, but there are resources to help you do this work at every single level. To close things out, we'd like to welcome Pam Blevins-Hinkle to the stage to take over from here. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Pam Blevins-Hinkle, Director of Spirit and Place, which is proudly part of the IU School of Liberal Arts at IUPUI. And my closing remarks will be brief, I promise, and mostly they are filled with gratitude. I am so thankful to St. Paul's Episcopal Church for hosting tonight and supporting the work of Spirit and Place. But mostly, I'm appreciative to St. Paul's and to St. Philip's AME Church for trusting Spirit and Place to be part of their journey toward racial repair. And I'm thankful to the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture at IUPUI for their support in helping to make tonight happen. I'm also incredibly privileged and honored and grateful to the Spirit and Place team, Aaron Kelly, LaShonda Crow-Storm, Alex Westland, and Randall Talley. And yes, I'm going to ask you to applaud them. And of course, I want to thank our speakers. I had the pleasure of talking with Dr. Gunning Francis for the festival's opening night event, and one of the things we discussed was how challenging it can be to face white supremacy in places and spaces that are literally sacred to us. I'm grateful for her shepherding tonight's conversation so that we might all do a better job dismantling white supremacy wherever we see it, in our homes, in our workplaces, and in our faith homes. I'm so grateful for Robert Jones for tackling such a difficult subject in a clear and approachable way, and for traveling halfway across the country during the pandemic to share his insights with us. Speaking truth to power is never easy. Thank you for being here to help Spirit and Place fulfill its mission and values. And lastly, I want to thank all of you who showed up tonight, who didn't just show up, but you're sitting with your own discomfort. This is a crucial step in the process of undoing racism. I invite you to fill out a survey and share your feedback about this event. Those in the audience were given paper evaluations to complete, and for those of you online, you can find a link to the survey on our homepage at spiritandplace.org. Please do share your thoughts with us. We use your feedback more than you know. And I invite you to keep this dialogue going by joining us on November 21st for our monthly session of Powerful Conversations on Race. These monthly sessions provide a means of getting comfortable talking about uncomfortable topics, and they are rooted in a shared arts or humanities material. They are highly participatory and designed so that you are doing the sharing. You don't sit back and observe, you are part of the work. We offer dual-track conversations each month, and on the 21st, you can choose between a dialogue called Race, Holidays, and Dinner Discussions, or continue this specific conversation on religion and white supremacy. You can register for that at spiritandplace.org to receive the Zoom link. And as we close, I have one more expression of gratitude. None of this work would be possible without the generosity shown by Lilly Endowment, the Allen Whitehill Cluj Charitable Foundation, Bolson Group, the Indianapolis Foundation, a CICF affiliate, the Nicholas H. Noyes Jr. Memorial Foundation, St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and hundreds of community partners, individual donors, volunteers, and community members. Between now and April 30th of next year, if you donate to Spirit in Place by going to the website or using the QR code in your program, your contribution will be matched 1-to-1 by Lilly Endowment until we reach our goal of $400,000. And we've raised $329,000 so far. Yeah, woohoo! You love that. Spirit in Place needs your help. Spirit in Place is a self-funded organization, and your support is what keeps us going and allows us to bring you a one-of-a-kind festival, year-round programs like Powerful Conversations on Race, training opportunities like the Arts-Based Community Development Workshop and the Racial Trauma and Healing Workshop that we held last month. You make it happen. Together, we can spark community transformation and we can change the world. Thank you and good night.